Hello and welcome to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast, a podcast where we discuss all things relating to your well-being, ranging from nutrition to physical and mental health and my 5-minute food fact series. I'm Amanda Hayes, your host, a nutritionist with a passion for well-being. Please note that, although I will often be speaking with experts, any information or advice provided in Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast is not intended to be used to treat, cure or prevent injuries or medical conditions, and is not a substitute for advice from your own health professionals. Today I'm excited to be chatting to an old friend from university days, 3-time Olympian, Jaime Fernandez. We'll be discussing the pathway of an elite sports person from the point of view of Jaime's own journey and also from the viewpoint of Jaime's current role at Rowing Australia, where he oversees the high performance program as Deputy High Performance Director. I love hearing about what it takes to make it to the top in a particular sport, in this case rowing. It is a lot more than simply training hard, as we'll hear about from Jaime. So Jaime, today I'd like to talk about the pathway of an elite sports person, and in this case the sport of rowing, from the grassroots level to the Olympic medal winning, and what it takes to get there. So obviously there are many attributes like talent, determination to work hard, and there are so many more factors, I believe, that play into success, like having a supportive family, especially for a young rower, a good coach, fueling properly with optimal nutrition, and having some psychological support. So I imagine it's a fairly delicate balance to make sure all those pieces of the puzzle fit together at the right time. So to start off, let's talk about your personal journey as an Australian rower. And I believe you almost fell into rowing. So can you tell us how and when you started?
Yeah, thanks firstly, Amanda, for having me on today.
It's a pleasure.
I think fell in is probably not a bad way of putting it. I mean, albeit we don't want to fall out of the boat, obviously. No. We want to stay in. But yeah, certainly, you know, my background was perhaps, not perhaps, it was probably very different to what the traditional pathway might have been for an athlete at that point in time, back in the late 80s. I grew up in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, so one would suggest probably as far away from rowing as you could imagine. Certainly no private schools, no waterways that you would put a boat on, like a rowing craft. And there was probably lots of other things in the water that you're looking to avoid rather than hopping into it. Definitely staying above it was a priority. So yeah, definitely fell into it. And it's a little bit of a long yarn, but I was playing senior football from an early age. A gentleman had moved to the Northern Territory, to Nullarbor, or Gove, as the town is called, in Arnhem Land. He had previously played in the VFA, which was at the time the level below the AFL. He turned up at training one day wearing a green and gold long sleeve, which, you know, I thought it was a wee bit peculiar at the time, considering, you know, probably still 26, 27, 28 degrees. May have been a bit wet and rainy, so it was a bit cold. But it was a green and gold long sleeve and it had a badge on the front of it. And this man had taken myself and another young player, and we were only 13 at the time, under his wing, and was looking after us as we were playing against all these big burly miners, trying to stay out of trouble. And I remember asking him the question, what's the deal with the long sleeve? And is it rowing? I could see the badge, and he said, what's the deal with the rowing, this sport? And he explained it, and he'd coached in Melbourne, he'd coached at an Australian underage level. And to be honest, I didn't think much of it. I sort of dismissed it sort of pretty quickly out of hand and got back onto training, and away we went. I had to leave the territory due to family illness. My brother was really quite sick with leukemia, and we had to make a decision as a family as to where we might move to, be that Melbourne or Adelaide. They chose Adelaide. I managed to stay in the territory by myself for a little bit. Somehow I convinced my parents to leave me there. So still this journey of rowing was a long way away. And growing up as I did in the territory, you know, you didn't spend a lot of time inside. I didn't know about the Olympics. I didn't know about the Commonwealth Games and things like that. They were sort of things a long way from my sort of thought process or dreams or ambitions.
And also AFL's not part of that, so you're not going to be exposed through that.
Definitely not. AFL was not sort of one of those things that you were going to the games, but AFL was the passion at the time, as were many other sports, because that was one of the beauties of growing up in this most amazing place. It was incredibly isolated, but by virtue of that, you had lots of people who really took it upon themselves as volunteers, as the mums and dads, to set up sports, to provide you with experience. And so it probably isn't a sport they hadn't had a go at one point in time through my 15 years in the Territory. But the rowing side came. I had to go to find a school in Adelaide when my parents eventually convinced me to leave the Territory. We went to the first school, and this was an interesting one because there's lots of different pathways by which athletes ultimately get to where they get to, probably like any person in a profession. First school, basically, we walked in. It's my mother, my brother, who wasn't looking too flash at the time. We basically had day release out of the hospital. We walked into the registrar's office, and within a few minutes, she effectively said, "We don't take people like you here."
In what
so that
sense? Like because you're from the Territory, or because?
Well, look, I don't know, Amanda. It was interesting because we probably looked a bit rough and ready. Mum may have put my rap sheet up and not my academic transcript. I don't know. There was clearly something about the vibe we were giving off that effectively just said, "No, this place isn't for you." And we sort of walked out, tail between our legs, headed back to the hospital. But unbeknownst to us, the young man who was in the isolation room next to my brother, who had, interestingly enough, the same form of leukemia, which was quite unusual and rare for a young person, he went to a local school in the city. They saw us come back. They asked the question, and they said, "Oh, look, leave it with us. We'll call the school," which happened to be Christian Brothers College on Wakefield Street. And they said, "Yeah, sure, bring him down. We'll catch up with him tomorrow and we'll have a conversation." And so here I was walking into this headmaster's office. Headmaster at the time was a big man. He had this Billy Idol sort of spiked hair, pretty impressive, posing-looking gentleman. But the first thing he did was, in complete contrast to the day before, he walked over and he put his hand out and said, "Oh, what can I do for you?"
Oh, how lovely.
And I thought, wow, a completely different approach to dealing with someone.
That's a place where you'd obviously probably much rather be in any event, where you're welcomed.
Absolutely. And so he sat down and he asked us our story. He took the time to listen. He was really quite considerate, and sort of told him the journey that I'd been on, our family had been on, which was quite a challenging one at that point in time. And effectively said, "Oh, you know what? I think this place is for you."
Wow.
Yeah, and we'd love you to be part of our community.
Oh, you're almost moving me to tears, and we've only been speaking for a few minutes.
Well, yeah, look, and it certainly brought Mum to tears. I mean, it's sort of, even me being a bit rough and very much a bush kid, sort of even I stopped it and thought, wow, he's a different person. And I think my story is punctuated by stories like that, or moments like that, where I was very self-determining. I had to look after myself quite a bit. I stayed in the Territory by myself, lived in the house by myself, and my parents and my brother moved to Adelaide for a period of time. But I always had some really important people take me under their wing or show me care and concern and look after me. And here was another one of those examples. So basically he said, "Rightio, you have to play a sport in winter and summer." Clearly footy was winter. Summer, I looked on the list, and lo and behold, there was this sport of rowing. And I said, "Oh, could I have a go at that?" And of course, I felt a wee bit sort of bold and sort of even thinking I could have a go at it, because I still wasn't really sure. I just saw the word, the name. Yeah. And I thought, oh, and I do remember the conversation then. I recalled that conversation with this guy in the footy team. And probably an important bit of information prior to me ticking that was when I left the Territory, this gentleman and I had actually both shared the best and fairest in a grand final that year. Me being the young buck and him the old bull. But when I left, he left a trophy on my bed and he had a sticker on it. And he basically said, "Look, I want to wish you the best of luck in your life. Whatever you choose to do, you'll be really great at it. and don't ever let anyone tell you you can't.
Oh, wow.
And so I took that with me,
Yeah.
that message. I shared that with the principal, and he sort of, he showed such sort of considered grace and wisdom. He just sat there and he just went, let me think about it. And he said, because most kids have started rowing in year 7, you're coming into year 11, and you'll effectively have about 3 terms of rowing to try and pick this up and before you finish. And he said, look, it won't be easy, but leave it with me. Next day I'm sitting there, so take this as a picture. I usually was in barefoot, maybe a garbage bag as a raincoat to get to school. Uniform wasn't mandatory. If I went to school because footy was played at lunchtime and recess. They were my goals. Certainly didn't do any study, didn't read a book. So completely different priorities. To here I am sitting in the front office in polished shoes, full suit, a tie, which I had no idea
Must
to tie.
have felt weird.
It was so odd, catching 2 buses when I normally walked across the road to school. So I was a fish out of water. I'm waiting there for the fall master, and this man by the name of Grant Bennett walks past. And Benno, as we knew him, he was a teacher at the school. He happened to be the head of rowing too. And clearly the headmaster had listened to the story, had shared the journey and the story I'd been on with Grant or Benno. He looks me up and down. I was a reasonable sized kid. And he sort of said, no, so I hear you want to have a go at rowing. Why? Again, it wasn't just dismissed. They actually wanted to understand the story of why I would wanted to choose this obscure sport that I had no idea about. And it was quite a unique sport, as you know. So I explained it, and he said, rightio, there's a ute out the back of the shed. You'll see a heap of kids mingling around this ute. Throw your bag in the back and run to the 5 k's down to the Torrens River where the shed is, and we'll see how you go. And I loved it from the first stroke I took.
The rest is history, as we're going to find out.
And that's how I got into rowing.
It was quite opportune that you met certain people at certain times in your life, wasn't it, that kind of steered you in that direction? Because, as you say, it is certainly back in the 80s, it was a reasonably obscure sport. It's not something that everyone's thinking, oh, wow, I want to try rowing, because, I mean, back then it probably didn't have such a high profile. So you said you loved it from the day you started. And did you continue? Did you continue through school to university? And again,
you know what CVC was like. It was a smaller school. It had been rowing for a long time. But we didn't have a large amount of rowers. And when I think about it, I could sort of think about the 9 of us who were ultimately in our first 8 at the time. 50% of us had rowed, 50 of us haven't. But somehow we managed to mesh this sort of interesting group of individuals, plus this great coach and Slim Lawrence and Benno and other support people, into a really competitive crew that ultimately won the Head of the River.
Oh, wow.
Out of this tiny little place. And the school had only ever won it one other time.
Do you know,
in its history.
For people listening in other states or other countries, that's really incredible, because in South Australia there's some incredibly well-funded schools with lots of boys, and they bring them back after year 12 for an extra year so they can continue to row. So these kids have all the advantages. So for a smaller school like the one Jaime was at to actually win, it's a big deal.
Yeah, it was, but it was just so much fun. Like we had really, for the time, innovative sort of coaches. They did some different things with us in terms of how we trained, the way we trained, and they clearly recognised that we had some talent and some kids who were really driven and wanting to do a good job. And we loved the idea of going up against perhaps the more fancied traditional rowing schools who had lots of success, and there were some fabulous ones. But I guess because of that experience and the fact that I did love the sport from the first stroke, and lots of it, parts of it resonated with me, the physicality, the team work, the friendships that came with it, the rigour and toil associated with it. It was something that I revelled in and I really enjoyed. And I never shied away from that. And I thought that was just fabulous. And then there's the competition and the history. And so all of those things went into this melting pot to make me think, I really like this sport. Although I have to say, probably Aussie rules or AFL was still the sport that I wanted to pursue. because again, I wasn't a kid who had a list up on his wall with all these goals and things that I was ticking off or wanting to achieve. I still really hadn't twigged about what other opportunities might be in sport. And I didn't necessarily think about the Olympic Games or those types of things. They weren't part of my thinking. However, I was fortunate enough to have a coach that probably saw some of those things in with me.
Yeah.
He then set about setting up an opportunity to introduce me to Adelaide University Boat Club. And that was a setup because they tried to get me down for a row. I agreed to. I thought I was just going to fill in one day. I was already in pre-season training with footy and stuff. Michael Southcott, who we both know, Southie, supposedly was unwell or injured, and I had to fill in for him. And Michael became a great friend, and his family great supporters of mine. So I was then had this experience manufactured. I jumped in, I enjoyed it, and before I knew it, I was involved in this fabulous club. There were some wonderful people that we both know, men and women who were rowing at that time, and they just made the sport interesting, exciting, enjoyable. And so it felt like a natural transition to continue doing that for a period of time, even though it was a really short period of time, because before I knew it, I was going from there to the AIS all within a period of 12 months from school.
That's extraordinary.
And away I went.
And I'll just say, so the Adelaide University Boat Club is where Jaime and I crossed paths, where we met. And I have to second what you said. When my kids asked me, you know, what was some of the best things you've ever done, I put rowing right up there. It was just so much fun. That sort of work ethic, I think, has stood me and everyone I know in really good stead since those days. And just a quick question, Jaime, for anyone from AUBC who's listening to this, were you ever mentioned in the SFW book?
No, I've never had the
Me either.
The distinction of being in there. Probably for good. It's a good thing, I think, isn't it?
I think it's a very good thing.
I'm sure there were plenty others who were having far more fun than us. By the sounds of it.
Yeah. Anyway,
but good people, very good people.
It was. So then, as you said, you took up a scholarship at the AIS, and you've gone on to have a very successful and distinguished rowing career. You've rowed in, I think it's 9 Australian rowing championships, including the King's Cup, and you've variously represented South Australia and the ACT. You've represented Australia on the world stage for the best part of a decade, I think. Is that correct?
Something like that,
yeah. You competed in 5 World Rowing Championships, usually in a Coxed 8, but I think once in a 4. You've competed in the Commonwealth Games and 3 Olympic Games, which include Barcelona in 92, Atlanta in 96, and 2000 Sydney, where you won a silver medal. You came second to the Brits by 0.8 of a second, I think. I watched that race the other day. Oh, my gosh. Even though I knew the result, my heart was in my mouth, I have to say.
I try and avoid watching it, but that's another story.
But it must have been amazing to be on the podium in your own country. I mean, that's like a dream come true.
Absolutely. All 3 games were fabulous experiences. And I guess if I could encourage everyone and anyone to be involved somehow, some way, be it a volunteer, coach, administrator, or athlete, if you're fortunate enough to have that opportunity. It's an amazing experience. And as I said, all 3 games were very different.
Yeah.
92 in Barcelona was a place that had some real significance for me because my father's Spanish. So being able to go to Spain and obviously Barcelona was just wonderful. And it was my first games. And I'd been on such a, I guess, short and sharp trajectory from picking up an oar, as I said, in year 11 to a few years later walking into Olympic Stadium.
Incredible.
Was still something I probably at the time didn't appreciate how quickly that all occurred. But it was great. Atlanta again, very different games to what Barcelona was, but then Sydney was this sort of incredible experience where people just embrace the games and the spirit of it.
Amazing, yeah.
And everyone speaks of the volunteers, and it's so true. Everywhere you went, people wanted to help.
Yeah.
People were just so enthused with the spirit of, the games, if for want of a better sort of term. But to actually compete in your own country, which is a real rarity, and it's great good fortune to even go to one games, let alone the three, but then to have a games in your country and compete at that.
Amazing.
Like nothing else than having your family and friends and the support and, of the Australian people.
It was an extraordinary time. I was living in Sydney at the time, and I just recall how the atmosphere of the city was just unbelievable. Everybody, almost without exception, was so friendly. It was just an amazing time to be there. And as you said, the volunteers were unbelievable. Everyone felt really welcome. It was just such an extraordinary time to be living in Sydney. I did go out and watch the rowing. My memory's not good because I was 8 months pregnant or something. So I can't remember which races I saw now, but I just loved being out there and the atmosphere of it all.
It was quite electric, really.
It was. So do you remember, Jaime, how you felt the moment you crossed the line and then later when it had all sunk in?
Yes and no. It was pretty exhausting, obviously, and maybe to provide some colour and context of what it's like. So, even I can still remember walking into the rowing centre for the first time and the games had started properly. And we'd done lots of visualisation and preparation to sort of get a feel for what it might sounded like, smelt like, tasted like, what it might look like visually. But I don't think anything prepared you for when you first stepped foot in and it was like, wow, okay, this is really going to happen. We're going to race. And I can remember going out for our heat. And we, every athlete or sport has some form of preparation they do in a warm-up. And we had this plan and all the rest of it. And we hopped in the boat and we went off to do our first warm-up piece. And it was just perfect. And I remember I was stroking the boat, talking to the coxswain going, well, I'm not sure we need to do too much more. That's about it. And I think we were just so ready and prepared for it. And we'd been to the opening ceremony a couple of nights earlier, which I think allowed us to actually lean into the experience and really embrace what we were about to face. Because we'd actually quite purposely trained everywhere and moved around a bit to just keep ourselves fresh. So we'd been to Mooloolambar, near Kingscliff, up near the Tweed. We trained in Bundaberg in Queensland. We trained in Penrith. We trained in Canberra. We'd been overseas. So we didn't have one set base. We'd been everywhere. It was almost like you felt like you were getting further removed from what was about to happen. So we made some really important decisions, i.e. attending the opening ceremony, which I said sort of started to build that excitement, then walking into the centre and then going out into the boat. And as I said, the boat was really singing. We didn't do any more warm-up. And in Penrith, you enter the course from the warm-up black about 750 metres from the start. And different to the normal pattern of the course for general purpose, you actually rowed across the course to the far side. Unbeknownst to us, the one thing we hadn't prepared for was just how many people were there and how far the crowd actually came up the course. Yeah. So we were paddling across. The next thing you know, it erupted. I sort of went, whoa. It was almost like brace yourself and your heart rate went through the roof. And, of course, you're going through, okay, calm, breathe. It's all going to be okay. You're nervous and shaky. So you paddle up to the start line. You put your stern into the starting blocks. Then they do the roll call and they call each country and then, of course, it hits Australia and this wave of sound just washes up the course and almost just envelops you. And everything spikes again. Your heart rate goes up and, the hairs on your arms stand on end. And you're getting ready to go. And, of course, they say go. And away you go down that course. And it was the same in the final. Probably the difference being in the final, we were, as you've alluded to, we're in a bit of a dogfight right toward the end. Yeah. We unfortunately started really poorly and we were a long way behind early. And the aid is travelling so fast and it has so much speed, it takes a long time to overcome the inertia and momentum of another crew. And so we just ever so slowly coming back, and towards the end we were coming back faster and faster, and as you can imagine, the crowd is just roaring, so you can't actually hear anything else, and you're also in a fair state of exhaustion. And I'm looking at the coxswain, I'm the closest person, I can see he's saying something, but it just looks like he's mouthing words. I can't actually hear exactly what he's saying. So we had a little signal. He would start to slap the side of the boat to let us know key points towards the end, where we had to just basically go up, 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 and wind to the line. And of course, my job as the stroke was to go up, 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 if I could, and keep driving. And it's almost like those last bits just get blocked out. You just hear the banging on the boat, and you're just going for it as much as you can. I didn't know where we'd finished. I wasn't sure of our placing. I just felt exhausted and probably overwhelmed by the fatigue. And then Dan Burke was in the 7th seat behind. I sort of said to him, "Where did we finish?" And he said, "Oh, I think second." And you know, there's a moment there of going, you know what? We'd set our whole campaign up around winning. That had been it. And initially it might have been a wishful dream. But as we progressed through the season, it was clear we had the capacity to do that.
Yes.
Or we were going to come very close, which 0.8 of a second is very close. And we'd been in a real
so close
hustle and struggle with the British 8 all year. And they were the better crew on the day. But, you know, maybe after initially sort of that, you have a moment of, we didn't achieve exactly what we wanted to achieve. There's also that other moment of going, wow, what a journey it's been.
Yeah.
And you know, how proud.
Look what we did achieve.
Yeah, look. And you know, like any athlete who's been working so hard towards something, sometimes you just need some time to reflect and compose yourself, and to, you know, at the end of the day, it's just sport. It's not, you know, it's just sport. I guess.
Just sport, but you pour your heart and soul into it, and your life is basically, that is your life. So
well and truly. Well, yeah, complete devotion to it in so many ways.
In terms of devotion, you certainly have devoted your life to rowing. After the 2000 Olympics, I understand that you retired from competitive rowing, but you really never left, because you've held several roles at Rowing Australia, and currently you're the Deputy High Performance Director there. So before we chat about that and what you do there, can you just tell us a little bit about Rowing Australia, what the vision is and what's its mission?
Absolutely. Yeah, look, I've been very fortunate that the sport has remained a part of my life. I ultimately became a teacher. And then through my teaching, I've been involved in rowing programs in schools. I've said a few times, I think if you cut me, I'd bleed rowing. But I've been so fortunate to have had the opportunities I had, be they as an athlete or a volunteer or as a coach, and now in this role as the Deputy Performance Director. And that role really encompasses a lot of our pathway. So working with the states and territories, working with our young athletes. So it's a real privilege. At the same time too, I think it's sort of been I've devoted a lot of my time and effort into it as well. And so I think whatever you put in, you often will get back out. Yeah. So I think it's been a real beneficiary for both sides of the ledger, I would suggest. But I guess Rowing Australia is a fabulous organisation, real privilege to be a part of. Our vision is to be the number one rowing nation in the world and the top Olympic sport. So they're lofty ambitions, lofty goals, but
why not? We're Aussies.
Why not? You know, what's that quote? You know, you shoot for the stars, and if you hit the moon, or something like that. You know,
the Awesome Foursome certainly did a lot for Australian rowing in terms of raising the profile. Didn't they? So
yeah, well and truly. Look, and I was fortunate to row through that era, and you know, those sort of gentlemen who were involved in that, and there were a couple of different changes along their journey from 1990 through to 96 when they won the second gold medal, and other people like the Peter Anthonys of the world and Reinhold Bartschys, who was, you know, obviously our head coach and really changed the the direction of the sport when he was brought in by John Coates and John Bolpe in the late 70s. Then to our modern athletes, the Kim Brennans or Kate Slatter, as she was known there, and Megan Marks in the pair in '96. So we've been really blessed to have some incredible athletes, and our current ones are just amazing. The amount of work they do, their commitment to the sport, the success that they've had under our new structure. It's just remarkable. I really admire them greatly.
So, Jaime, what do you do? What's your role involved?
Yeah, look, my role entails looking after, effectively, there's 8 programs, and I'll talk a little bit about those, but there's 7 Australian-based programs. So in every state and territory, being the ACT, we have a rowing program. And that rowing program is basically a tri-party sort of agreement between the state sporting organisation. So in South Australia, where we went to school, there's the obviously Rowing SA, and then there's SASI, the South Australian Sports Institute, and then there's ourselves. And those 3 key stakeholders come together to support aspiring young athletes in what we call our pathway. And we look to identify good young talent. We endeavour to support them, develop them, and ideally retain them in the system for a long period of time, because that's a really important thing. You know, rowing, you can row for a long time. Yeah. And in fact, you have to row for a long time to build that motor, that engine, the maturity. And statistically, you know, a bit like myself, I was 27, 28 when I won my medal. That's actually statistically pretty consistent with what we see. And you've often had to have attended more than one Olympic Games. So you have to be prepared to commit quite a bit.
To the long haul.
That's right. And my role is to work with those key state partners, as I said, across the country, to help set up a systemised approach to identifying young talent, supporting young talent, and then retaining young talent in our system for the long term.
So I've got 2 questions about that. How do you actually identify the talent? Can you look at somebody and tell whether they, you know, if you watch someone rowing, can you think, oh, that, you know, person in number 3 seat's got real potential, or is it a bit more than that?
Yeah, look, you would love it to be that. That would be great. But as you know, there's so many different things. And in our sport, we're looking for typically long levers. So you're going to be of a certain height, certain arm length. More often than not, you're looking for longer legs and shorter body, you know. So there are some anthropometrical requirements that you can go along and say, look, that might be the ideal body type or shape, or anthropometrics that might suit. Then there is the engine, so the cardiovascular capacity and ability, or the VO2 max. Yeah. You know, are they an endurance-based athlete? You know, you might find a young person who does really well at the 1,500 metres in running, or the cross-country at school, and you go, okay, well, that's maybe the type of engine. In AFL, you know, would probably be those tall, lean, running half-back or half-forward line, or wingers, ruckman, you know, those types of body shapes and types. But can you actually predict? It's not so simple to predict, because there's these other things that you need, and a really important thing is called grit.
Yes, yes.
So what's that internal fortitude like as a person? What sort of resilience? How can they overcome setbacks, get back up off the canvas? So you might have the most complete physical capacity in the world, but if you don't have that drive and passion and capacity to actually utilise what genetics has provided you, then it's pretty tough. So it's not an exact science, but clearly you need certain things. You know, you need the body type, you need power, you need endurance.
I love, that's one of the reasons I love reading biographies and autobiographies of sports people, because it's that the fascinating thing for me is that grit, you know, that ability to keep going even when it's tough. But the second question I had about your role is, you talked about working with the stakeholders, and so you've got the 7 different institutes in all the states. Do you have some kind of I guess, common sort of coaching strategy or style? So when people do arrive at the AIS, they've got a similar sort of understanding of how to approach rowing. You don't want to have completely different styles and then trying to undo everything. And I don't know, how does that work?
Yeah, look, and that's probably the other bit when you're talking about talent and how, what's the athletic acumen of a young person? Can they pick things up quickly?
Yeah.
Do they have touch, feel? Because the thing that's probably not relatively well understood about our sport, to me, our sport, people think of it as a physical sport, whereas I probably think of it as a technical sport.
Yes.
I understand you need the physicality, but you need to have the ability to apply that physicality to move a very narrow piece of material of carbon. You need to have absolute synchronicity to the other people if you're in a crew boat outside of the single. You need to make sure your blades go in the water at the same time. You need to do all those sorts of things to ensure that the boat's going to move efficiently and effectively. So for me, rowing's about timing as much as it is about anything. It's about grace. It's about feel and touch.
Yeah.
You can't deny the physicality. You need that. But I think when you combine those two, and we spoke about some of the great athletes we've had, well, they had those things. They had physicality. They had great genetics. They had trainability. They had grit. And they were able to apply that into moving a boat really well, and Drew Gin often talked about, will it make the boat go faster? So how do you do that? It's an interesting thing. Yes, we do have a technical model, and there are, even in our two national training centres now, we have the men based in Canberra and the women in Penrith, and they do have some differences in the style of how they row. The job in the pathway is about developing a generalised skill set.
Yeah.
It's ensuring that there are some consistencies in the way that we want to move a boat, some of the basics about the sequencing of the stroke cycle, the type of training that people do. So that's, again, part of our role is providing guidance about training principles, about technical principles, about even things around sort of putting the right people with the right people. So when a young athlete does ultimately transition from the pathway into a national training centre, it's really then the role of that top end will say, okay, now we want you to fit a particular type of style or mould. What we need to do is set them up well and what we call NTC ready them, get them ready for the NTC. Well, our national training centres, we want to develop a young athlete who's agile, robust, has taken care of their vocation and or studies, whatever it might be. We think really holistically about the athlete in the pathway. We want, and we understand that the life load of a young person is quite tricky and challenging. They're very busy. There's lots going on. There's lots of things that pull on their time. We want them to set themselves up for the long term. We want them to maintain friendships and relationships. So we know they're probably going to work, they have to commute in busy cities, and we want them to train.
Yes, you're right. There's a lot of moving pieces there that need to fit together.
Yep.
But I like the way you said you take a holistic approach, because as tragic as it can be, people can get injured, and you don't want someone to sort of end up with, having put all their eggs, for example, in the rowing basket, have an injury and then have nothing. So you do need to look after them, into the future. Yeah. I mean, hopefully that won't happen, but...
agree.
It can. But you mentioned the training and coordinating that. So I think one of the things that I loved about rowing and that fascinates me is how much training rowers, and we'll talk about elite rowers here, actually do. So could you give us a bit of a rundown of what a typical training week might look like for some elite athletes in your program?
Yeah, just as a general view, most rowers who, once they're sort of moving into that upper end of the pathway, say in the under 23 space and then into our national training centre space, they do a significant amount of work. And, they train most days twice a day. Typically you have a Sunday off, but all the other 6 days of the week you're training probably a minimum of twice. And in our senior programs, often they will do 3 sessions a day on various days, depending on where they are in a periodised program. So it's a significant commitment that you're signing up for. And those sessions can go from anywhere between, depending on what it might be, anywhere from an hour, 90 minutes up to 2 hours, 2.5 hours, and longer if they're out on the bike. And there are various modalities that we use as well. So clearly there's the on-water component. And a lot of our senior athletes will do a lot of work in the single scull before they transition to a little bit later in the season into their crew boats. We encourage that in the pathway as well, because the single is a great training tool.
Yes.
It's you against you.
Yes.
So the load is yours to carry and you need to work that out. And so there's a physical element with that, but there's also a mental and a technical component, so it's a great training tool. There's the ergometer, so that horrible black machine that doesn't float.
I still shudder when I think of those things.
Yeah, some people love them, some people don't, but it's a great tool because it's so efficient. It's stable. The score is the score. You can control the variables really easily, and you can get a really efficient workout. So, many of our rowers will be utilising ergometers as part of their training. I mentioned cycling. So, cycling sort of towards mid part of my career as a rower, cycling became quite a fashionable thing, and a lot of rowers started to do quite a lot of miles, and that continues. Clearly there's things with injury and got to be careful on that side of things. And then there's the strength and conditioning side, where typically, on average, you're probably in the gym 3 times a week, building that sort of core strength, those key sort of skills, developing your body, making sure you're robust to do all that other work. And then running would be another component that some athletes would use, depending on where they are in the season, depending on their own personal makeup and things like that. So there's quite a load in terms of what our athletes will go through, and they then need to commit to that. It's like 11.5 months of the year program, and you get a couple of weeks off over Christmas to recover, or maybe a couple of weeks post a major championships. But 11 months of the year plus, you are working consistently, and it varies obviously depending on the time of year and the type of work and the modality and how much time you might spend on a particular aspect. But it's pretty consistent in terms of frequency, load, etc.
That's all coordinated in such a way, I guess, to minimise the chance of injury. So you're varying the types of activities throughout the week. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, you do. You more look at it from the perspective of what type of work do you need to get done.
Right.
And there's no denying you have to do quite a considerable amount of work. They're managing things like injuries, etc. Clearly there's the physio, the massage, the soft tissue. They play a critical part in ensuring athletes can stay on the water. Nutrition, obviously fueling the system really well with the right types of fuels means that you're able to, ensure there's enough energy in the body to recover and repair just from normal training, let alone injury. But it's also athletes being self-aware, self-managing as well, in terms of making sure they understand their bodies well, and they do all the little things really well, with the flexibility, the stretching, the warm-up, the cool down, whether it's getting soft tissue work to make sure their bodies remain supple. And then there's the load management aspect of understanding what an individual athlete might require, what might be their little quirks and nuances, and how you manage that load to ensure that they can do all the work you require, ideally avoid injury, but keep being able to stress the system so it develops and improves.
In terms of injury, are there injuries that are more common in rowers than others? Like, are they more likely to suffer, for example, from a shoulder injury, or what are the most likely injuries for a rower?
Yeah, look, typical injuries, there's a couple in particular. So there's intersection syndrome with rowers' forearms.
Right.
And again, I'm not a medical person, so I won't pretend to...
looking for a flavour of what that, you might be, trying to watch out for?
Yeah. So typically that comes with load and grip, things like that. So the forearm then struggles to be able to maintain grip. And so I guess it's like a tendonitis that occurs within that forearm. So that's one type of injury. Lower backs, typically with rowers, because they're under so much load, do so much mileage, and they're always in a flex position when that load is at its greatest through the catch. And then notwithstanding then the load that comes from doing things like squatting, ergo use. So those sorts of things can really tighten, stress the hip flexors, the glutes, the hamstrings, the back muscles, which means that, you need to be really cognizant of that, really taking care of it to ensure that you can try and avoid that. And then probably the third one is rib stress injury.
Right.
So through our rib cages, the load, the boat's carbon, the oar's carbon, and they're really quite stiff materials. And so the load that goes through the oar and the boat has to transfer somewhere, and that comes through the handle into the body. And so if you get really stiff thoracically through your rib cage and through that region, stresses then can come out onto the rib itself and create some hot spots and different things. So they're probably the three injuries that we need to be really mindful of and try and prepare athletes for. And typically they come, so the rib stress typically comes when we have sudden changes in load.
Right.
So you might have had a quieter period, or in this COVID experience, lots of athletes are off water or can't access gyms. They could still at least probably do the ergo if it's available, so they can maintain a load on their rib cage, which is important. But typically it's when there's spikes in load or changes in load, and they probably just haven't managed things as well as perhaps they could have, or things like that. Or that's on the ergometer.
True of any sport, really, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Have you had any injuries, any that have kept you out of the boat, or have you been lucky?
Well, I was pretty robust as an athlete, so I was sort of a bit bomb-proof, really.
Yeah. Maybe that was the bush upbringing, sort of rough and ready. Yeah.
Maybe I just didn't work hard enough too. Who knows?
Sure, but that's not true.
My injury though came post, and it was probably because I didn't at the time. I have to say I didn't really ever have to miss sessions. As I said, I was pretty robust. I could do basically everything that was required of me. But it wasn't until years later when I'd stopped rowing that, unbeknownst to me, I had a bit of a suspect back that ultimately went. And I remember the doctor saying, look, if we knew that at the time, we wouldn't have had you row or do deep squats. And I went, okay, I'm not sure I would have changed anything.
No.
Is the reality. So, I had a lower back injury. I use a stand-up desk. I make sure I'm sort of still maintaining my own well-being to ensure that it doesn't create any issues.
So you manage it. In fact, that is one of the questions I do want to ask you is how do you keep fit these days? What do you do?
Yeah, well, when I retired, I went back to playing AFL and rugby. So I just loved it. It was great fun. And I wish I still could, to be honest. But no, look, I exercise every day. If I'm not in, I'm really fortunate. I've got a great home gym that I can go in and do some basic, probably strength and conditioning type exercise, which I find helps me feel more robust. And I think does really help with my back, etc. I like to walk, which I really enjoy. Again, I find those things work for me, and that's probably the key point is identify what works for you. And then on every other day, I'll sit on the bike in the gym for about an hour. And so I do something for about an hour or so every day, and that I found that's really been a great
keeps you ticking over
for me.
Keeps
absolutely.
You fit.
Keeps me young.
Do you have a dog, Jaime?
We have a couple of dogs actually.
Do you walk them?
I do at different times, but they're the kids' dogs, so they need to be walking them and looking after them.
Fair enough.
But pretty fortunate. I live in a great place. There's lots of space and lots of opportunity to get out and about.
Back to the rowers, we've been talking a little bit about their training and how they need to look after themselves with, say, soft tissue massage and physio and eating well. psychology is another huge part of performing at an elite level, and we talked about grit. And I think do you know Amber Halliday, who I interviewed?
I do. Yes, I do indeed.
So she set up an excellent business called She Thrives in Sport, which promotes resilience, performance and well-being for female athletes. So she's taken everything that she learnt, and she said she wished that she'd known this when she was training at an elite level. So what kind of support do your athletes have around their mental well-being?
Yeah, look, we're quite fortunate in many respects. We get great support through Sport Australia and the AIS in terms of funding that helps with the engagement of a role called an athlete wellbeing person who works with our senior athletes, assists them with their studies and other aspects of transitioning into our 2 national training centres and that. We obviously have a good admin team around as well that supports and tries to make the life of the athlete as good as it can be. We also have access to the AOS mental health referral network as well that has been set up in recent years, which provides access for athletes. And both historically and currently, if there are some challenges for athletes and things, whatever they might be, we always look to provide access to the appropriate service and or practitioner to support that. Part of the challenge, and if they're anything like me, is you didn't always go and seek that out.
No, but I do think that things have changed a bit and people are more aware of, and there is more support available. So it does sound like your athletes have access to everything they need, which is great.
Yeah. Look, we have been fortunate in that regard, and I can only commend those organisations and our own for continuing to invest in that space and area.
It's so important.
It's so vital and critical that young people, men and women, are well supported off the playing field. And that psychological well-being is critical, and that is whether it's about ensuring they're well set up for the future, whether it's about performance aspects or just other life aspects. The reality is, as human beings, we're pretty complex creatures, and we live in an ecosystem that has lots of things getting thrown at it all the time. And to think that those things don't have an impact or play a role on performance is a bit foolhardy. So the more we can do in that space, I think the better.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And Jaime, perhaps you can help me with a rumour that I heard once, was that at the AIS, the rowers eat the most food of all the athletes. Is that true?
I reckon it wouldn't be too far off the mark. And it's interesting you say, when I first moved there, and I was only young, 18 years old, and I went into this professional sort of training environment, and I can remember just losing enormous amounts of weight by just the sheer volume of work that I was doing all of a sudden compared to what I'd been doing previously. And I literally couldn't keep the weight on.
Amazing.
And I remember going to see the nutritionist at the time, and she said, look, I don't say this to many people, but you have, you have a pass to eat anything and everything you can, and as much as you can, because we just need to stop you losing all this weight. And so literally,
you lucky man.
I would have these meals that were sort of almost, rather ridiculous in some respects, but that's what I needed to do in terms of to fuel myself to do, those 12, 14 plus sessions a week. The volume of work, plus being young and growing and all those types of things. So we ate huge quantities of food.
Oh, well, Jaime,
every single meal.
May or may not remember this, but when we were at an intervarsity competition in Queensland and we'd finished, and a group of us were staying at a hotel on the Gold Coast, I think, and we'd been out and we came back to the hotel, and I do remember you consuming a whole box of Sultana bran and a loaf of bread as a snack.
Easy. That was usually before bed. So, I mean, I think about it now, and thankfully my eating habits have changed in terms of quantity. But I was always an athlete who was mindful of eating. And as I said to you, our coach, Ryan Holbachi, was really particular about, you don't put he used to use the term or analogy, you don't put diesel into a Ferrari. So,
Absolutely.
put the right fuel in for the right job that was at hand. And so the AOS was a fabulous place because obviously the food was prepared, it was well managed, we had access to it, there was lots of it. And, the athletes who were fortunate enough to be there were able to do that. And, rowers definitely took advantage of that.
Oh, well, sounds like you needed to. So, Jaime, back to the present, how has COVID-19 affected or impacted the program?
Yeah, quite significantly. And but again, as I say, we are sport. We're not, it's not life and death per se. So there's so many horrible things that are happening. It's such a challenging environment for people. In saying that, though, as you can imagine, young people like those in rowing and other Olympic sports, had in essence, for many of them, had a boarding pass stamp saying you're going to the games in Tokyo, and then all of a sudden it's gone. So that's heartbreaking, and we need to thinking about the mental and the psychological well-being of our young people, and it clearly has an impact, and that's an important thing to recognise. It was already having an impact because even before that moment, you could tell there was things were happening in the world, and it was clear that, or I felt it was becoming clear that the games this year is going to be a pretty hard ask. So it's had that massive impact on our senior athletes. But not only that, all our underage athletes as well would normally have world championships this year, and they've all been cancelled, of course. It's also meant that we've had no competition. People have had to modify training significantly. They've not been able to train in some instances. We were talking about the strength and conditioning before. That has been a really big one that's changed because access to gyms has been limited. We've had to go out of big boats down to small boats, lots of ergometer use. So there's actually some benefits in this too. Funnily enough, there's always some blessings and benefits, and that is young people doing more work in the single, accessing the ergometer more. And so we've actually seen some positives from a training perspective. But the biggest one is just that connectivity and that ability to be around other people, to share stories, to have a hot chockey or go for a walk with someone, or just be in that banter in a training environment that's really quite positive and uplifting and healthy from a psychological perspective. And that's been the biggest impact. Our two national training centres, thankfully, have been able to reactivate when that was allowed in the two states. So they've been training. We have strict COVID guidelines that we follow. We've minimised the number of non-essential high-performance staff in the two centres. So it's really just the core group, the athletes and their coaches and some of the support staff. So we've done lots of things to try and ensure that they're safe environments for the athletes, so they can keep training. And, they've had to reposition, pivot, sort of change their goals and prepare for what we hope might be a games in 2021.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it's been massive from the sounds of it. I mean, I know even personally I have a few races in my diary that have been cancelled. They're triathlons, and it's quite demotivating. So,
Absolutely.
That's another thing
Really
I
tough.
guess you're having to deal with. And especially in elite sport when you as you said, you periodise your training, so you're building right up to it, and then your event goes away. When's the next one coming? What do you do? It's quite tricky to manage, I think.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah, and look, I certainly take my hat off to the athletes and obviously the staff around them, just to really working hard with them. But the athletes, it's such a big impact on them and their lives.
Huge.
Keep in mind, in the context, we're talking about sport, obviously, but it still is a really important thing that they have been working hard for. They've been striving for it. Lots of them have put lots of things on hold.
Yes.
Relationships and travel and studies and work and careers and things like that to strive for this opportunity to represent their country at the Olympic Games.
I mean, when I know you said it's just sport, but I think it has such a huge impact on the psyche of the country. Watching Australians perform well at the Olympics is very uplifting. So
absolutely,
it's I think it's a really important part of the Australian identity is, we love our sports people.
Yeah, absolutely. We just obviously we acknowledge everything that's happening in the country and around the world.
Oh, and, I know. It's just...
you keep that in perspective of what you do and don't do.
Absolutely. You're quite right. And so, Jaime, who inspires you?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting. I've been asked that recently a couple of times, and clearly there's these wonderful athletes that have, and we're just talking about how inspiring sport is. The Olympic Games as one of the biggest events in the world. I look at those amazing athletes that attend or compete in sports all around the world, and I admire what they can do. But probably for me, interestingly enough, it's the people that inspire me and I admire most are those who are the selfless sort of people who give of themselves. They don't ask of anything. They've often that battler who's scraping and crawling for every last sort of centimetre or inch that they get in life. I guess I'm quite pragmatic, and I think my family is that way as well. So I look at those, and I think about my father, who, he was a tradesman. He emigrated from Spain to Australia, had to learn another language, had to transfer his trade, work 6-7 days a week, 12-14 hours a day, just to make sure you could survive, let alone anything else. And then I look inside my own sport and I see the wonderful servants of the sport who have just devoted themselves. And I've mentioned Ron Alpachi a number of times. What he gave to our sport, just how determined and desperate he was for us to achieve things and to get great outcomes, not himself. So those selfless leaders, we lost a great gentleman in Dr. Stephen Hinchy in recent times who devoted decades of his life to the sport. I was fortunate enough to have him as a team doctor. He's done everything in the sport at the same time as being an MD. So they're the people who inspire me. They're the people who make me go, wow, how they do that, how they're so giving. And that servant leadership model, I guess, is the big thing for me.
It's a pretty wonderful way to live your life, I think, isn't it, to be giving?
I think so.
Yeah.
You get so much back, I find, when you do.
Yeah, and that's not even why you do it, is it? But that's just a very happy byproduct of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and they're the sort of people who I guess inspire me when I look at that, and what they devote in the cause for others is something that's really quite special.
Yeah, and I think you see that on many levels. So for me and the local triathlon club I'm a member of, some of the people there, they're all volunteers. They devote so much time and effort to organising things for the rest of us. They're just excellent humans.
Yeah, look, in our sport, I think probably like lots of sports like rowing have been so reliant on volunteers and volunteerism throughout its history. And then you look at mums and dads who, are devoted and committed to getting their children to sport and all those types of things. They're the things that I think are really special.
And I think the rowing parents, and I'll put swimming in this category as well, deserve a shout out because they are often getting up really early.
Well and truly, and that's part of our job, isn't it, as parents, it's just to be there, to do those things, to support, and for our children to know that, no rain, hail or shine, we're backing them for them to do whatever it is that they want to do. So, I take my hat off because I think I talked about those stakeholders before, being the state organisation, the National Institute Network, ourselves. But, the key stakeholders are obviously the people like the mums and dads, the volunteers, the athletes that invest in our sport as well. And that's why I think I feel so privileged to do what I do. And I probably work with 90% of our sport in terms of the participants.
Yeah.
So it's a real honour to do that, because when you look at the investment that people make, it's quite significant.
It is indeed. And so, Jaime, I think it's probably time to land this plane. So I'll ask my final question, which is, if you could recommend 2 things that all people could do to improve their well-being, what would they be?
It's an interesting one. Look, I think taking care of oneself is a really important thing. And for me, as we talked about, that ability to be surrounded by friends and family is really positive and uplifting. But also staying physically active and engaged, because I think that has not only the benefits for you physically, but mentally, emotionally. And often it might mean too that you connect with others when you do it.
Yeah,
and so
totally agree.
They're probably the things that I would always sort of pin my hat on and want to do myself. Certainly won't be so presumptuous to tell others what to do.
No, but just
in
your opinion.
Yeah, and that's always been me. I love to do things with others. I always love the camaraderie and friendships that came with being involved in sport. That hasn't changed. So that's something I still look for and crave. And I find being able to go out and being physically active to do those things is just this wonderful complementary thing that occurs.
Yes, I'm with you there. And so, Jaime, if someone's interested in having a look at what Rowing Australia does, where should they look? What's the website?
Yeah, look, there's obviously Rowing Australia has its website, and it has all our contacts on there. So you can certainly go to that. There's also Instagram. I'm not the greatest social media expert going around. I'm probably still a bit of a Luddite when it comes to that.
Oh, you've got kids. They can help you.
Yeah, well, yeah. I may even be advanced to them. They're real bush kids, so they're probably worse than me. But no, look, the Rowing Australia website, there's the Instagram as well. So, there's always lots of different articles. You can go on there and subscribe, or obviously you can like. There's the Facebook page as well,
Great,
where you find lots of interesting, fun articles, information, education. But if you're wanting to actually talk to one of us, then I'd direct you to the website itself,
right,
at rowingaustralia.com.au, and you would find our contacts in there. And we'll always love to chat to you, particularly about rowing.
Yes. Excellent. Well, I'll put links to that in the show notes. So, Jaime, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed chatting with you and remembering all those wonderful rowing times that we had.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Amanda. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity.
And that was the inspiring, warm and accomplished Jaime Fernandez. Thank you for listening today, and I do hope you found the interview interesting. If you did, please share the podcast and tell your friends about it. And if you could take a minute to leave a rating on Apple Podcasts, it will help people find my podcast. If you would like to subscribe to my podcast, Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast, you can subscribe on all good podcast providers like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Spreaker, Overcast, iHeartRadio and Google Podcasts. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Simply click the red subscribe button. Please follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and check out my website at www.amandaswellbeingpodcast.com, where you can contact me via the contacts page. Feel free to suggest topics you'd like to learn more about and people you'd like to hear interviewed, and I will do my best to deliver that to you. Producing the podcast is a labour of love. It has become my full-time job, to which I dedicate a lot of time, money and effort. If you enjoy my podcast and would like to support it, I would be so grateful. You can make monthly or one-off contributions via my Patreon page or via PayPal from the support page on my website. I'll put a link in the show notes and please do check it out. Another way you can support my podcast is by purchasing a book from the book reviews page on my website. If you click the Amazon link on my books page and buy a book, at no extra cost to you, I receive a small commission. Thank you very much for tuning in. Eat well, move well, think well.